I imagine that some of you may well be saying, giants? Why giants? There are so many other worthwhile subjects to consider in the Bible, and you chose giants? And perhaps there's some others who are already a little bit excited about the subject. After all, ever since we were kids, we've known that any story that had giants in it was going to be a good one, right? Maybe you still remember doing David and Goliath at Sunday school as children, and afterwards you'd race outside to swing slings and slay giants. Or maybe you can remember that frisson of fear, hearing the story of Jack and the beanstalk for the very first time and lying in bed that night, wondering if just maybe giants were real, and if that's what was making that menacing creaking noise in the hall outside. Because giants were scary, right? Giants, they were the stuff of nightmares. They were terrible creatures who lurked in our dark, coming out to invade our dreams, standing there, the cast of night terrors, along with the monsters under the bed and night wolves. And, well, a little while back, Cyrus, my middle son, his dream seemed to feature a particularly scary dog who kept on eating his food and had a very threatening hat. Giants were scary. They were scary, but then we grew up, didn't we? And under the scrutiny of adult eyes, they faded and they shrunk, and eventually they were put away in the toy box of all of our childhood memories. Except that unlike night wolves and underbed monsters and hat-wearing dogs, giants were once very, very real. All through the childhood of God's nation, giants roamed the rugged mountain areas of the land. Throughout these early years, there's really a surprising number of men of faith, of great men of faith, who encountered these walking nightmares. Abraham did, and Moses and Caleb and David and a number of others encountered giants of note. Some of them, there's so many named giants. There's Anak and Arba and Og and Ahiman and Ahiman's brothers Sheshai and Talmai and Lamai and Sath and Ishbai Benob and of course Goliath. And so it's little surprise that giants loomed large in the minds of the Israelites in those early years. And they're the stories we're going to spend our exhortation on. And at this point, you would be forgiven for thinking, sure, there's stories about giants in the Bible, but this is a Sunday morning. Sunday mornings should be sacred ground, shouldn't they? It's that precious heartland of our week. It's an hour or two that all the roads in the week that is past should lead to. It's a starting point for all the paths that we will walk in the days that lead away from here. Until once again, at week's end, all those paths, they'll curve back here, won't they? To the foot of the cross, to a simple meal of bread and of wine, shared with others on similar but curving paths, as we all remember our Lord, a man we never met, but we know he's present here this morning. And we'll reflect. That's what Sundays should be like for us, right? We should feel drawn to this very hour and to this fellowship with him. That precious time we've got now to look inward and to plan our course for the rest of the week. So that when we return here at week's end, we come back here with joy to share with him and with his family all the things that we've seen and we've done in his service in the 7 days that have passed, as we arc back in through these doors to this very table. That's what this hour should be. But all too often that's not the case, right? Sometimes Sunday's not our oasis. It's not the welcoming hearth to which we're drawn, but sometimes it feels like a weary truck stop on a long and dreary road, or a chore, or a distraction from the real issues of our life. Sometimes when we get here, I'm speaking about myself, maybe you're different, but sometimes when I get here, my head is so full of struggles and the noise of the week that we barely even have time to sit down. I feel this sometimes. I'm standing up, I'm sitting down, I'm singing, I'm eating, I'm drinking, and before I know it, I'm back in the car again, and Ariel's saying to me, "Wasn't that a great exhort?" Yeah. What was it on again? I sort of lost the thread of what the speaker was speaking about. Oh, when did you lose the thread? About an hour before he began. Because there are giants. There are giants out there on our paths away from the Lord's table. Giants are real, and I suspect most of us have giants we are fighting. Terrifying figures that loom large in our minds, and they grow larger in the darkness of our doubt. There's powerless frustrations over what's happening at work. What our boss said, what? That wasn't anything to do with me. There's worry about the kids and the friends they are making, or maybe they aren't making. There's worry about a loved one's mental health and well-being, or maybe our own. That child who's in hospital, yet again, still no better. There's worry about our ecclesia and our family and so many other things besides. And these giants, they roam the trackless wastes of our worries, and they seek to undermine our prayers and strip meaning from our worship this morning. And 1 Samuel 17 is the tale of one young brother's encounter with just such a giant. Verse 4 introduces us to Goliath of Gath. But the truth was that his family were most likely not Philistines. 2 Samuel 21, we won't go there, informs us that Goliath was a descendant of the giant, not the giant of Gath, but in Gath. Because you see, the giants had roamed the land long before the Philistines outgrew the hills around Gerar. And the giant who fathered Goliath was not of Gath, but most likely was a refugee living amongst the Philistines. Joshua 11 describes Joshua's conquests of Hebron and of Debir and Anab, which was the mountaintop redoubts of the giants. And it describes how that the giants only survived if they fled and found safety amongst the Philistines. That was the only place in the whole land that they could find refuge in the time of Joshua. And here, if you like, that's kind of Goliath's origin story. It explains his Hamas-like hatred of Israel and of their God. Because their God was the God who had commanded the occupation of his land, the expulsion of his ancestors, the death of their leaders, his family. And he hated that God and his people. And what a family he had. We know that Goliath was unnaturally large. I mean, after all, he was a giant. It kind of goes with the territory, doesn't it? Verse 4 tells us he was 6 cubits and a span. A cubit is an interesting measure. It seems to move a little bit, but roughly 500 mil. And some of you might be looking to this side of me and have noticed a slightly unusual cross on the wall. That cross marks 6 cubits in a span. Now I'm just going to move over here. So you have a sense of scale. This is measured not from stage height, but from floor height. Gang jolly for scale, so that you can see how tall Goliath was, brothers and sisters. 3.25 meters, give or take. That's very, very tall. And he wasn't just tall, but he was also horrifyingly strong. Verse 5 tells us at the end of the verse that he was wearing a coat that was 5,000 shekels of brass. That's about, well, how do we put this? The Hebrew indicates that this was a coat of scales. So this is no quick, dry, lightweight athleisure for the high-performance Philistine warrior. This is heavy-duty armor. And Goliath, we think, probably weighed in, based on that 5,000 shekel measurement, at 73 kilograms. Again, Dan Jolly for scale. I happen to weigh 73 kilos. He would put one of me on as his coat and still be able to run and fight in battle. That's terrifyingly strong. Just his coat. But together with that strength and height, there came issues. There were all sorts of nasty genetic aberrations in his lineage and family. His family had quirks. We learned later on that he had a brother with extra digits. He had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. Polydactylism. It's a real condition. And it indicates a very unusual genetic deformation. Deuteronomy 2 talks about another group of giants called the Anakim, who intriguingly lived in the same territory, in the Philistine territory, long ago. And while they were probably no direct relative of Goliath, this people's name hints at the genetic baggage that came with giantism. For the Anakim comes from a root word that means twisted and crooked and hunched. So here's a man who's dispossessed, he's genetically flawed, he's isolated. And perhaps Goliath's own name captures this history of wrongness and of brokenness and loss, for his name means to be stripped bare, like an exile, like a refugee. No wonder Goliath was bitter. And in verse 1, we're provided very specific details of where the confrontation occurred. It happened in a place called Ephes Dammim, the boundary of blood in the valley of Elah, a valley that runs west from below Hebron's height, widening out to a broad open valley with a narrow gorge or riverbed running down its middle. This was the perfect theatre for the battle. The Philistines would have been camped on the southwestern ridge lines, while the Israelites were on the north. And the Philistines chose a really unusual strategy for this battle. It's actually a strategy that's culturally foreign to the Middle East. To send out a champion to settle this battle in one-on-one combat, winner takes all. In fact, in verse 4, that word champion there, it really captures this idea because it means a middleman, the man between the two, as in two camps. And this conflict was going to be negotiated by just 2 champions, 2 men outside their own camps, all alone in the middle while everyone watched this grotesque blood sport play out. And it appears from verse 16 that for 40 days, Goliath would come out and scream his challenge, extending this challenge, marching down from the Philistine encampment that curved around the hills behind him to the valley's floor each dawn and each dusk, and crying out his demands. And during these 40 days, David was busy. David was shuttling to and from the Israelite camp from Bethlehem, keeping his brethren presumably supplied in sandwiches and clean laundry. Verse 15 tells us that. It says that David went and returned. Young's literal said he was going and he was returning. Rotherham says he kept going and returning from Saul. And so David's shuttling back and forth each day from Bethlehem, making sure the socks are clean and there's fresh cheese. But after 40 days, Goliath changes his pattern. Verse 23, as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words. And this time, David heard. This time it's different. For Goliath screamed his challenge, not at dawn or dusk, times when David would have been just leaving or just getting back from Bethlehem. It's a 7-hour trip by foot from Bethlehem to the valley of Elah. He couldn't have been there at dawn or dusk. But this time he comes out presumably around midday, and David witnesses this challenge. And not only did he change the time of his challenge, but you can see it says there that he came up. The champion came up, verse 23. So this time, instead of loitering with grim menace in the valley floor, on this day, Goliath began climbing up the other side of the valley, up towards Saul's camp. And so there's no wonder, verse 24, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, they fled from him and were sore afraid. He's not down in the bottom anymore. No, he's coming up. He looks bigger when he gets closer. And it says they fled, and the word fled there is quite evocative. It means to flit away, to vanish. It's not the act of bolting so much as making yourself very, very scarce. And you can imagine as Goliath's vast form sprinted towards them, an entire encampment working very, very hard to blend into their surroundings. You know, shh, I'm a palm tree. And so, for the very first time, this young man, destined to fight history's most famous one-on-one battle, sees the giant for himself. For 40 days, he's always just missed him. He's only heard the tone of dread in his brother's shaking voices. But now, as this giant charges up towards the center of the camp and towards Saul of Benjamin's pennanted tent, way out there on the flank in the cheap seats, among the conscripts from Judah, David sees. And I think we can follow his chain of thought in verse 26. He spake to the men that stood by him, and he said, what shall be done to the man that kills the Philistine? And he's, I think, asking a rhetorical question. I don't really think that David's interested in a reward. By this point, David already knows he's going to be king. And even when he's king, greed and an interest in wealth, that wasn't, as far as I can tell, ever one of David's vices. David's not interested in the reward. He's not trying to clarify its size. In fact, even after David is told what the reward will be in verse 27, the people answered him after the same manner, so shall it be done. He keeps on asking. Verse 30, he turned towards another and spake after the same manner. What will be done? And he was answered in the same manner. Can you see what's happening here? David walks into the camp, he sees Goliath, and then the men say, hey, this is what's going to happen. This is the size of the reward, verse 25, for someone who kills the Philistine. And David's response to that was, having just heard what the reward was, to say, what was the reward? And then verse 27, they say, oh, didn't you just hear? We just said it. The reward was this. So he walks somewhere else and says, what was the reward? You see what's happening? He's asking again and again and again and again what the reward was. And clearly, whatever David's objective is in repeating this question, it's not about the answer that he receives. Now, I think what David is trying to achieve is something else. And I want us to note the humility and the absence of pride here. David assumes that somewhere else in this camp there will be a man of faith, a man of greater faith and maturity than himself. A man who maybe just needs a nudge to get out there and fight. And so he wanders the camp, loudly wondering what the reward will be. And yet he's phrasing that question, that rhetorical question, very carefully. What will be the reward for the man who kills the Philistine? Anyone? What will be the reward? The one who removes, he says in verse 26, Israel's shame, who frees us from this embarrassment. I mean, after all, isn't that enough reward? The one who will reverse our national humiliation. It's a very rhetorical question. He's giving the reward that he thinks that they should be thinking about. And I think we can clearly see his target and audience because of how he ends this provocative question. To paraphrase, he's saying, no reward should be necessary, for that Philistine is no one. He stands alone by himself, unprotected by the covenant, unconnected by hope, by his uncircumcised state. And despite that, he's reproached the battle line of the living God. Now, the sort of person who would hear the appeal in David's pitch here would be the sort of person who valued the covenant, who understood at a deeply emotional level how circumcision, or in our case, baptism, freed us from slavery and sin, freed this warrior to serve God, to fight God's battles. That's who David's calling. Someone who feels strongly about the covenant God had made. And I'm sure you noticed the other detail there. David adds a flourish, if you like, almost a special hook or a lure to those who knew their Bibles. He finishes with a very rare phrase. He calls God the living God. And with those two words, the mind of any man of faith would flash back hundreds of years to a stark black mountain and a vast twisting fire, taller than any giant, and a trumpet growing louder and louder, and that voice, the voice of words, and a faithless generation who said, we do not want to hear what the living God has to say. He's not a safe and silent and dead God like the gods of the Egyptians. He's alive. And the faithless generation realized that this God was awe-inspiring and vital, and they didn't want to hear. And 38 years later, Joshua stood on the far side of Jordan, anticipating that they were going to invade a land teeming with vast hordes of battle-hardened adversaries. Canaanites and Hivites and Hittites and Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, Jebusites. And he quotes the faithless generation, and he says, in encouraging the people, he says that the living God would drive out all their enemies, Joshua 3. And David would remember that the living God did. That living God smashed Jericho, stopped the sun in its tracks in the day of battle, made Samson so strong and Deborah so wise, a God who was alive. And David is appealing to men of faith. And he didn't do this because he was a coward. He wasn't hoping that someone else would get up and do the hard work. But I think because he genuinely believed that in this camp there must be someone, a man of greater faith than he. He didn't assume that he was the greatest spiritual warrior in Israel. And so he wandered the camp, asking the same rhetorical question as it gradually dawned on him that the man, the other man, the man between the camps, would have to be him. Despite that conclusion, though, I think there's a really useful lesson, a vital truth for us in our battle with our own giants. And that's this: we are rarely completely alone. Our God is always with us, but sometimes we don't sense that, do we? Sometimes we just need a hand to hold ours, and almost always there is another brother or another sister fighting the same giant as us. Or perhaps that giant's brother. We're not told where Jonathan was on this particular afternoon. And doubtless God had planned it this way, but we know for sure Jonathan would have stood with David. And if he was on sick leave, well, maybe his armor bearer would have too. Both of them had already proved themselves to have absolute confidence in the face of overwhelming odds in fighting God's battles. And by the end of David's reign, 4 other men will have fought giants on their own too. We're never alone. There are others when we fight giants. Well, we know the story. Saul hears about what's going on out in the cheap seats, out in the Judean side of the encampment. And after some initial qualms of conscience and half-hearted attempts to dissuade David for going into battle, Saul realizes that, look, this could be a really big win for me. David was a young man already publicly connected to Saul and his court. And as such, David would be viewed as a protege of Saul's. And here's David, he's willing to go. Look, he's even insisting that he will fight Goliath for Saul. And you can almost see the cogs whirling in Saul's mind as he offers David his armor and his sword. I can almost imagine him quickly summoning the royal sign writer to repaint his armor. This champion of Israel, proudly sponsored by Saul, established BC 1103. You see, this was a real win. If David, his man, his servant, fought the giant and won in his armor, everybody would realize that Saul was behind that victory. Saul had enabled the victory by providing all the necessary equipment. And if he lost, well, Saul had done everything possible, even giving his very own sword to help. But on trying on that armor, David realized he was worse off in it. Clearly, the picture we have of a toddler trying to put on Saul's armor doesn't fit with what's going on here. David must have been no featherweight himself. He could, within the realms of sensibility, wear the armor of the tallest man in Israel, Saul. But he chose not to. Instead, he insisted in the lightest of possible armor. He was armed not with steel, as we know, but with faith. And so he descends to the valley's floor. He finds a creek bed cutting through that valley floor, and he selected from its waters 5 river-smooth pebbles, cut from the mountain without hands, before standing to face that giant and his armor-bearer. Verse 41, and the Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the short shield went before Goliath. They're close enough now to be able to closely inspect one another. And when Goliath saw David's weaponry, a staff such as one would use to guide a sheep or urge on an unwilling ass, and a leather sling, he was enraged, seeing in this choice of Israel's champion a deliberate insult. Am I a dog, he says? You've come out to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by not his gods, his God, singular, David's. And what happened next is one of the most famous events in all time. You would struggle to find someone in your workplace who can't make sense of the phrase, oh, that's a David and Goliath-like struggle, isn't it? Even today, 3,000 years later on, people know this story. It's lodged in the psyche of almost everyone. Goliath stood, and David ran towards him and towards the whole Philistine camp, as if able single-handedly to slay them all. His swing whirling. Verse 48, it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, he took thence a stone and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. The giant doesn't even have time to adjust his helmet, to pull it down over his forehead, or even to draw his sword before the stone hits him. And that's that. Goliath is dead before he hits the ground. The giant who defied the God of life, defeated by a young man with a rock. And the record emphasizes this very point. Verse 49, David put his hand in his bag, he took out a stone, he slung it, and the giant fell to the earth. Verse 50, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone. Can you see the emphasis? You can almost hear the record emphasizing this over the top. There's almost this amazement in the writer's tone, in the tone of the record. It's such an unequal battle, such an unlikely outcome. This was not a fair fight, right? It just wasn't a fair fight. On the Philistine side, there was a giant, battle-trained, a veteran of numerous conflicts, armed and armored, supported by his armor bearer, and backed by the armies of the 5 kings of the Philistines. And on the other side, a young shepherd just arrived from the sheepfolds of Bethlehem, standing beside the living God, the Lord of all the earth, Yahweh Sabaoth himself. It was never fair, for David walked with God and Goliath never had a chance. And he didn't walk, he ran. He ran towards this confrontation. And his urgency and his passion, it reminds me of a powerful sentence. And it goes like this: our love for God is shown by our hatred for the things that are against him. And he ran. We need to run to face our giants sometimes, armed by faith. But sometimes we're scared, aren't we? And we want to stand at a safe distance, hoping someone else will take it out for us. We started by saying that giants were scary. And in most of the records of the encounters with giants, fear is a really big part of the story. And yet, in this story, I don't know if you noticed, it's almost conspicuously absent, isn't it? Sure, other people in the camp were afraid, but David, he seems completely unmoved, doesn't he? A man with nerves of steel. And as we draw our exhortation this morning to a close, I want to follow just one little thread that I think helps us see just a glimpse of David's inner monologue as he descended down into the valley. And through the lens of David's thoughts, I think we will be able to turn our mind towards our Saviour and our King. You see, back in verse 2, we were told that this epic struggle played out in the valley of Elah. The word valley there is the Hebrew word emek, and it means a vale, a broad open valley. The valley, the broad open valley of oaks. And in verse 3, we're told there was a valley between them. The two armies were separated by a valley, but this word is not emek. It's not a broad depression that's being described here, but rather a narrow ravine, steep-walled and deep, the bottom hidden in deep shadow. So, what's that? Well, the Hebrew word there is the word gahi. I've pronounced it completely wrong, but someone will come and correct me afterwards. But it's the same word that's found in the name Gehenna. Gehenna, in fact, is a Greek transliteration from Gahi Hinnom, the valley of Hinnom, the ravine of Hinnom, Gehenna. And in the life of David, this same word is used to describe the same word that's used here to describe the ravine that separated Israel and the Philistines, that separated David and Goliath. It only shows up 2 more times in his story. It shows up in 2 Samuel 8 verse 13, and it's used to describe a valley in Edom in which a great victory is attributed to David as the architect of Israel's success. But more than likely, it was actually Abishai who was the general on site on that occasion, leading the charge in that particular ravine. There's only one other time in the whole story of David that this word shows up. One other passage in the long record of David's life in which he faced a foe in just such a valley. Come across to Psalm 23. A fairly predictable passage to go to, but I find this really useful in understanding the mind of David. Psalm 23, verse 4. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Over David's long and turbulent career, he faced many challenges. He fought many wars. But as far as we know, only once did he walk in a ravine that he might call the valley of the shadow of death. And in this psalm, I think we can hear the words that David repeated over and over again in his head as he faced this terrifying foe deep in the shadowed valley. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. As well he might. For the phrase, the shadow of death, it's not just a kind of pretty word, pretty phrase. It spoke of that irresistible sense of impending doom. I don't know how many of you have experienced this at some point in your life, a time of extreme anxiety in which you feel like your death is hurtling towards you. Some of you may have had medical treatment in which the drugs themselves will give you the sensation. Others of you may have experienced times where your fear was so much that you felt that death was certain. An irresistible sense of impending doom. In Job, it's used of the thick darkness at the bottom of a black and inky mine shaft. In Amos, it's used of the absolute impenetrable night that existed but prior to God saying, "Let there be light." And I'm reminded of one who said to his foes, "This is your hour and the power of darkness." David was not immune to fear. He was no more immune to fear than you or me. And as he began to climb down into that valley, he felt the darkest of foreboding, an unshakable sense of dread, every fiber of his mind screaming out that he had made a terrible mistake. As did another man in another valley with a garden. But they hadn't made a mistake, had they? For God was with them. No evil was worthy of their fear. And as we finish our exhortation this morning, brothers and sisters, God is with you too, brother or sister, when you too brave your personal giants in the company of the living God. And so now we're going to turn to our champion, our middleman, the one who went without the camp, walking through the valley of the shadow of death for all his people, and having slain the giant sin, is now crowned with honor and glory and dwells in the house of the Lord forever.